The high-tech facial recognition scanners didn't trigger. The elite sentries at the gates didn't move. They just stared in stunned silence as a small, 7-year-old girl walked through the heavy iron gates of the Sungwon estate. No shoes, a dress stained with the dust of a long journey, and a muddy backpack clutched to her chest. In this fortress of the Korean underworld, no outsider ever breathed the air without permission, least of all a child. Lee Sungwon stepped out onto the marble balcony, his irritation cutting through the room like a blade. "Who allowed this breach?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. But the girl didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the guards. Instead, she raised a small, trembling hand and pointed a finger directly at the massive, gold-framed portrait in the center of the hall. Her voice was small, but it shattered the silence of the mansion. "Sir, why is my mama's photo in your house?" The dragon's composure vanished instantly. Sungwon's jaw tightened, and the glass of expensive whiskey in his hand tilted, unnoticed. Every guard in the room turned toward the painting. The image of Crystal, the woman Sungwon had spent a lifetime trying to erase from his records, but could never remove from his heart. The woman who had vanished into the shadows years ago to protect a secret he was only now seeing in the flesh. As the girl clutched her backpack tighter, her watery eyes met his. Sungwon's heart thundered against his ribs, not because of the breach, but because of a terrifying realization. The girl had his eyes. "Stay with me until the end, because the secret Lee Sungwon is about to uncover will dismantle an empire and turn this entire story upside down." Before we dive into the shocking truth, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. Now let's begin. The crystal tumbler in Sungwon's hand tilted precariously, a single amber drop of whiskey falling like a heavy tear onto the polished marble floor. For 20 years, he had been the architect of silence, a man who moved pieces across the city's chessboard without ever raising his voice. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of respect or fear. It was the deafening ring of a secret being ripped wide open. The guards stood like statues, their eyes darting from the small, mud-streaked girl to the towering portrait of Crystal. To them, the woman in the green dress was a ghost, a forbidden image that the boss stared at when he thought the house was empty. To Ruby, she was simply Mama. Sungwon set the glass on the balcony railing with a hand that, for the first time in his career, possessed a microscopic tremor. He descended the grand staircase, each footfall echoing through the atrium. Up close, the child looked even smaller, a tiny island of pink fabric in a sea of cold stone. Her natural puff bun was slightly lopsided, tangled with tiny bits of leaves, and the dirt on her dress suggested she hadn't just walked past the gates. She had crawled through the underbrush of the estate's perimeter to find him. "Look at me," Sungwon commanded, his voice raspy. Ruby lifted her chin. The defiance in her gaze was a physical blow. She didn't look at his gold chain or the dark ink of the tattoo snaking up his neck. She looked straight into his soul with eyes that were dark, deep, and hauntingly familiar. They were the same eyes that looked back at him from the mirror every morning, yet they were softened by Crystal's warmth. "I asked you a question," Ruby whispered, her voice cracking but refusing to break. "My mama has this same picture in a tiny frame by her bed. She told me the man who had the big one was the only person in the world who could help if she ever went away. Are you that man?" A collective intake of breath hissed through the room. The guards shifted, their hands hovering near their holsters, waiting for a signal to remove the intruder. Sungwon didn't give it. He stepped into the light of the chandelier, the glow catching the sharp angles of his jaw. "Crystal." He breathed the name so softly it was almost lost to the air. "She told you to come here?" Ruby nodded, reaching back to pull the strap of her worn backpack tighter against her shoulder. "She said if the men with the snake tattoos ever came back to the flower shop, I had to run to the hill with the white walls. I ran for 3 days. The mention of the snake tattoos turned the air in the room to ice. The Black Snake Syndicate, the very animal Sungwon had spent a decade trying to keep away from Crystal's door. He realized then that the shocking truth wasn't just that he had a daughter. It was that his silence hadn't protected Crystal at all. It had only left her alone to face the monsters he had created. Sungwon knelt, his expensive suit trousers hitting the floor as he leveled his gaze with the girl. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her cheek, hesitating to touch something so pure. Ruby didn't flinch. She leaned into the space he offered, a silent demand for the protection she had been promised. "You're safe now, Ruby," he said, the words feeling heavy and strange on his tongue. "The silence in this house is over." The air in the atrium seemed to thin, the heavy scent of expensive cologne and old wood giving way to the metallic tang of rain and road salt clinging to the child. Sungwon stayed on one knee, his shadow stretching long across the marble. He could feel the eyes of his men on his back, predators watching their alpha show a flicker of humanity. "The backpack, Ruby," he said, his voice regaining its practiced steel, though his eyes remained fixed on her face. "Let me see what you carried across those hills." With trembling fingers, Ruby slid the straps from her shoulders. The bag hit the floor with a dull thud, the canvas stiff with dried mud. Sungwon unzipped the main compartment, expecting to find toys or clothes. Instead, he found a folded map of the city, a half-eaten granola bar, and a small, velvet-lined jewelry box that had seen better days. He pulled the box out, the weight of it familiar in a way that made his pulse skip. When he clicked the latch open, a soft shimmer of green jade caught the light of the chandelier. Inside lay half of a heart-shaped locket, fractured down the middle with surgical precision. The gold filigree was shaped like a dragon's wing, intricate and sharp. Sungwon's hand went instinctively to the hidden pocket inside his suit jacket, right over his heart. He pulled out a small silk pouch and emptied its contents into his palm. There it was, the other half, the second wing. 8 years ago, on a rainy night in a Seoul tea house, he had snapped that locket in two. He had given Crystal the left side, telling her it was a compass that would always lead her back to him if the world became too dark. He had kept the right side as a penance, a reminder of the life he had forced her to leave behind to keep her breathing. He pressed the two pieces together. They didn't just fit. They locked with a magnetic click that echoed through the silent hall. The dragon's wings were whole again. The jade heart was complete. "She kept it?" he whispered, the realization hitting him harder than any physical strike. All this time, she kept it. Ruby watched him, her breathing hitching as she saw the two halves unite. "She said it was the key to my father's heart," she said, her voice small but certain. "She told me that if the two pieces ever touched again, I wouldn't have to be afraid anymore." Sungwon looked at the locket, then at the girl. The resemblance wasn't just in the eyes or the stubborn set of her jaw. It was in the way she stood her ground in a house full of wolves. She was his blood, his legacy, and his greatest vulnerability. The shocking truth settled into his bones with a cold finality. He was no longer just a boss. He was a father. And the woman who had spent 7 years protecting this secret was now in the hands of men who would use that love to destroy him. He stood up, the joined locket gripped tightly in his fist. He turned to Tony, his most trusted lieutenant, whose face was a mask of grim understanding. "The Black Snakes think they found a weakness," Sungwon said, his voice dropping an octave into a register that made the guards straighten instantly. "They think they can use my daughter to break me. They are about to learn that they haven't given me a weakness. They've given me a reason." The cold weight of the reassembled locket in Sungwon's palm acted as a tether, dragging his mind back 8 years to a summer that had felt like a fever dream. Before he was the Dragon of Seoul, he had been a man suffocating under the expectations of a bloodline he hadn't chosen. Then came Crystal. She had been a burst of color in a city of gray suits and rigid hierarchies. A traveling photographer with a laugh that could cut through the thickest tension. She had captured him not with a camera, but with a gaze that saw past his title. They had met in a small, rain-slicked alleyway in Itaewon, where she was trying to photograph the neon lights reflecting in a puddle. He had held an umbrella over her, and for the first time in his life, Lee Sungwon hadn't wanted to be anywhere else. That summer was a montage of stolen moments. Late-night street food under the glow of paper lanterns, whispered promises in high-rise apartments, and the intoxicating feeling of being known. Crystal didn't care about the territory he controlled or the men who bowed when he walked by. To her, he was just Sungwon, A man who liked his coffee too dark and his poetry too sad. But a mafia heir's heart is never his own to give. The shocking truth of their romance had traveled back to his father, a man who viewed love as a terminal illness. The elder Lee hadn't used bullets to end the affair. He had used a folder. He had sat Sungwon down in this very mansion and showed him photos of Crystal leaving her apartment, unaware of the red laser dots dancing on her back. A dragon does not nest with a songbird. His father had hissed, his voice like dry parchment. You have two choices. She leaves tonight, or she never leaves at all. The memory of that final night burned hotter than any bullet wound. Sungwon had met Crystal by the Han River, the jade locket clutched in his hand. He hadn't told her the truth, that his father's men were already positioned in the shadows, waiting for his signal. He had lied. He had told her she was a distraction, a summer whim that had grown stale. He had snapped the locket in two, the crack of the gold sounding like a bone breaking, and handed her the left side. Take this and run, he had whispered, his eyes cold to hide the scream in his throat. If I ever see you again, I won't be the one holding the umbrella. I'll be the one holding the gun. He had watched her retreat, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, thinking he had saved her. He had spent the next 8 years believing that by breaking her heart, he had preserved her life. He never knew she had been carrying a part of him, a living, breathing legacy named Ruby, into that exile. The flashback faded as Ruby tugged on his sleeve, her small hand warm against his suit. Sungwon looked down at his daughter, then back at the portrait of the woman he had tried so hard to protect through cruelty. The forbidden summer was over, and the winter of his consequences had arrived. The black snakes hadn't just taken a woman. They had taken the only light he had ever known. The silence that followed the memory of that forgotten summer was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a storm about to break. Sungwon looked at the joined locket in his hand. The gold wings finally aligned, and felt a cold dread settle in his marrow. If Crystal had kept her half all these years, if she had raised his daughter in the shadows of this very city, then she had never been truly safe. She had been a ghost living in a world of monsters. The heavy oak doors of the study burst open, the sound echoing like a gunshot against the marble. It was Min-ho, Sungwon's head of intelligence, his face pale and slick with sweat. He held a tablet in one hand, his fingers trembling as he bypassed the usual protocols of silence. Boss? Min-ho breathed, his voice tight with a fear that Sungwon hadn't heard in years. We just intercepted a transmission from the industrial district. The black snakes. They didn't just find her. They've been watching the flower shop for weeks. Sungwon's grip on the locket tightened until the metal bit into his palm. He didn't look away from Ruby, whose small face had gone deathly still at the mention of the shop. Tell me everything. Now. Min-ho swiped the screen, casting a grainy surveillance video onto the large monitor on the wall. The footage was shaky, taken from a hidden camera across the street from a small, vibrant florist tucked between two gray warehouses. In the frame, 3 men in heavy leather jackets, the unmistakable ink of serpents coiling up their necks, were dragging a woman toward a black SUV. It was Crystal. She wasn't the regal woman in the green dress from the portrait anymore. She was wearing a simple apron, her hair pulled back, fighting with a ferocity that made the 3 men struggle to contain her. But she wasn't fighting to escape. She was screaming toward the back alley, pointing frantically for someone to run. She wasn't taken because they found you, boss, Min-ho whispered, his voice cracking. They found her because of the girl. They realized she was the weak spot, the one thing Crystal would die to protect. They used a fake delivery to get inside, and when Crystal realized they were there for Ruby, she drew them away. She gave the girl the chance to run. The video cut to black. The shocking truth settled over the room like a shroud. Crystal hadn't been a casualty of his past. She was a prisoner because of his future. The black snakes didn't just want territory. They wanted the dragon's bloodline. They had taken the mother, and now they were hunting the child who stood trembling beside him. Ruby's breath came in short, jagged hitches. They hurt her, she whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the dirt on her cheek. Because of me. Mama is gone because I didn't run fast enough. Sungwon stood up, the joined locket now a cold weight of responsibility. He looked at his men, the soldiers who had seen him as a heartless ghost for years, and saw them waiting for the order that would start a war. He reached down and placed a hand on Ruby's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, but one of alliance. She didn't stay because she was weak. Ruby, Sungwon said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal intent. She stayed because she knew I was coming. The black snakes think they found my weakness. They're about to find out that a dragon doesn't protect his treasure with gold. He protects it with fire. Sungwon stood before the massive mahogany desk, his fingers tracing the edge of the joined locket as if it were a talisman. He looked at the digital maps of the industrial district, a chaotic sprawl of gray blocks and blind alleys where the black snakes had vanished with Crystal. His strategists had been staring at these grids for hours, finding nothing but dead ends. They're moving her between the old canning plants, Minho muttered, his eyes red-rimmed from the glare of the monitors. Every time we get a drone over a sector, they slip through the subterranean service tunnels. It's a ghost hunt, boss. Ruby stepped forward, her small shadow falling over the glow of the desk's built-in screens. She didn't look at the digital displays. Instead, she reached into the side pocket of her muddy backpack and pulled out a stack of folded napkins and a box of cheap, broken crayons. It's not a ghost hunt, she said, her voice dropping into a focused, rhythmic cadence. It's a game. Mama called it the invisible path. She said that if we ever got separated, I had to remember the rules of the game. Sungwon watched, mesmerized, as his daughter began to spread the napkins across the desk. On the back of each one, in crude but remarkably accurate lines, Crystal had sketched sections of the city. But these weren't standard maps. They were annotated with symbols, small red dots for sleepy dogs, guards, blue lines for hidden water, underground pipes, and yellow stars for the quiet doors. Mama worked at the flower shop, but she spent her lunch breaks walking the dogs in the district, Ruby explained, her small finger tracing a path through the warehouse sector. She made me memorize the quiet doors because she said the big gates are for show, but the small vents are for family. Sungwon felt a chill of realization. Crystal hadn't just been hiding. She had been scouting. She had mapped the very fortress of his enemies, turning the industrial wasteland into a playground for a child's memory. She had known that if the day ever came, the dragon would need a guide who could see the cracks in the wall. Ruby placed a final napkin in the center. It showed a detailed layout of the cold storage facility, the most heavily fortified warehouse in the Black Snake territory. She pointed to a small, circular mark near the loading docks. "This isn't a vent," Ruby whispered, looking up at Sungwon. "It's a laundry chute from the old days. It leads straight to the basement where they keep the heavy packages. Mama told me that if I ever had to find her, I should look for the room that smells like iron and cold air. That's where they take the people they want to hide." The shocking truth was laid bare on a series of dinner napkins. Crystal had provided the blueprint for her own rescue, encoded in a game she had taught their daughter during bedtime stories. She had turned Ruby into the most effective spy in the Lee Syndicate. Sungwon looked at Minho, who was already cross-referencing Ruby's sketches with the satellite data. The red dots on the napkins matched the heat signatures they had been struggling to identify. "She's given us the back door, boss," Minho breathed, his awe evident. "We can get a team within 50 yards before they even know we've crossed the perimeter." Sungwon looked at Ruby, then at the joined locket. He reached down and tucked one of the napkins into his suit pocket. The game was over, and the real hunt had begun. He didn't just have a daughter. He had a partner who held the keys to his enemy's kingdom. "Suit up," Sungwon ordered, his voice echoing with the finality of a death sentence. "We're going through the quiet door." The industrial district was a graveyard of rusted iron and long shadows, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of flickering streetlights. Sungwon moved through the darkness like a ghost, his black suit blending into the soot-stained walls of the cold storage facility. Beside him, Ruby was a small, silent blur of pink, her hand gripped firmly in his. He had draped his own tactical jacket over her shoulders to hide the bright fabric of her dress, and to his surprise, she moved with the practiced stealth of a predator. "The quiet door," Ruby whispered, her breath hitching as she pointed toward a rusted iron grate tucked behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets. It was exactly where her napkin map said it would be, a forgotten laundry chute, invisible to the high-tech cameras circling the main gates. Sung-won knelt, his fingers finding the seam of the grate. With a sharp, controlled tug, the rusted bolts gave way with a groan that seemed to echo for miles in the heavy silence. He looked at Ruby, his eyes hard and searching. "From this moment, you are a shadow," he breathed, his voice a low vibration. "No sound, no matter what you see. Do you understand?" Ruby nodded, her small face set in a mask of terrifying determination. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was a soldier in a war she hadn't asked for. They slid into the darkness of the chute, dropping onto a pile of damp burlap sacks in the basement. The air here was different, thick with the scent of ozone, old grease, and the metallic tang of iron. The shocking truth of the Black Snake operation was laid bare as they moved through the corridors. This wasn't just a warehouse. It was a torture chamber designed to break the strongest spirits. A guard appeared at the end of the hall, the serpent tattoo on his neck glowing under a dim bulb. Sung-won didn't hesitate. He felt Ruby's hand slip from his as he lunged forward. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance, his hand muffling the man's scream while his other arm delivered a precise, lethal strike to the temple. The guard crumpled silently. Sung-won turned back, expecting to see fear in Ruby's eyes. Instead, she was already standing over the fallen man, her finger pressed to her lips in a silent command for her father to keep moving. She was Crystal's daughter, but in this darkness, she was unmistakably his. They moved through the sublevel, a trail of incapacitated sentries marking their progress. Sung-won worked with a cold, surgical efficiency, clearing the path while Ruby scouted the corners, her small size allowing her to peer under doors that his men would have had to kick down. At the end of the final corridor, a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar. Low, mocking laughter spilled out into the hallway, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against concrete. Sung-won pushed the door open, his silenced weapon raised. In the center of the room, Crystal was bound to a chair, her face bruised but her spirit unbroken. Standing over her, a silver-headed cane in one hand and a cigar in the other, was Marcus Castano. He looked up, a slow, yellow-toothed grin spreading across his face as he saw the dragon and the ruby standing in the doorway. "I knew you'd come through the back door, Sung-won," Marcus rasped, the smoke from his cigar curling around his head like a halo of ash. "I just didn't think you'd bring the leverage with you. It's a bold move, trading your legacy for a ghost." Sung-won stepped into the light, his hand resting on Ruby's shoulder, the joined locket hanging from his neck like a badge of war. The rescue had reached its breaking point, and the master of the Black Snakes was about to learn that some traps are built to be burned from the inside out. The tension in the basement room snapped with the suddenness of a lightning strike. Marcus Castano had barely finished his taunt when Sung-won moved, not with the hesitation of a negotiator, but with the lethal finality of a predator protecting its young. The dragon's weapon spoke twice, the suppressed thuds masked by the sudden, piercing whistle of the warehouse's steam pipes. Marcus fell before he could raise his cane, the cigar tumbling from his mouth to die on the cold concrete. Sung-won didn't wait for the body to settle. He was across the room in 3 strides, his blade slicing through Crystal's bindings. As she slumped forward, Ruby was already there, her small arms wrapping around her mother's neck in a silent, sobbing embrace. Crystal's bruised face pressed into her daughter's tangled hair, her eyes meeting Sung-won's over Ruby's shoulder. In that gaze, the 8 years of silence, the lies, and the snap of the locket were all forgiven. 6 months later, the morning sun over the Seoul hillside didn't hit the cold, gray stone of a fortress. It illuminated a home. The iron gates that had once signaled exclusion were now draped in climbing jasmine, and the elite sentries had been replaced by a silence that no longer felt like a threat. Inside the mansion, the transformation was total. Sung-won stood in his study, the open collar of his black shirt reflecting a man who had finally found his breath. On the mahogany desk sat a heavy silver bowl. With a flick of a gold lighter, Sung-won ignited a stack of leather-bound ledgers, the records of the Lee Syndicate, the debts of blood, and the maps of a criminal empire. He watched the blue flames devour the names of his enemies and the secrets of his past until only ash remained. He walked out into the grand atrium, pausing before the forbidden wall. The massive, solitary portrait of Crystal in her green dress still hung there, but it was no longer a monument to a ghost. It was surrounded. Pinned to the expensive wood paneling were dozens of new additions. Ruby's crayon drawings of butterflies, messy finger paintings of the Han River, and a series of framed photographs taken by Crystal since her return. There was a photo of Ruby laughing on a swing, a shot of the three of them at a flower market, and a candid image of Sungwon, his slicked-back hair windswept as he taught his daughter how to fly a kite. "Papa, look!" Ruby's voice echoed off the marble, no longer a trembling whisper but a bright, confident ring. She ran toward him, holding up a new sketch of a dragon and a small bird flying side by side. Sungwon knelt, catching her with a practiced ease. The joined jade locket hung openly against his chest, a complete heart that would never be broken again. Crystal appeared at the top of the stairs, her dark skin glowing in the morning light, her smile no longer a painted memory but a living reality. The shocking truth had finally been written into the foundations of the house. Lee Sungwon had destroyed one empire only to build a greater one defined not by the fear he could instill, but by the love he was finally brave enough to claim. The dragon had found his peace, and the mansion on the hill finally had a soul.